Today is August 24, 2017, and it is the new moon of the 6th Hebrew month. And as usual, we'll start with asking our Heavenly Family to guide us. Heavenly Family, thank you so very much for another new moon. Thank you for an opportunity to eat fresh fruit from the tree of life. Wisdom, help us to understand the message that you have for us. And guide us to be grounded in an understanding of the messages that you've given in the past and how they relate to the message that you have for us today. Help us to think rightly. Please help me to convey the message that you want me to convey and to deliver it with its true emphasis and impact. Thank you so very much. Bless us. Please guide each person in this meeting to understand the truth. Thank you. We ask this, Father and Mother, B'Shem Tzemach, Hu-Hi, in the name of Branch, he and she. Amen.
Amen.
Okay, so there is actually so much that I feel impressed to convey, and I doubt that there will be time and opportunity to convey all of it in this meeting, and some of it, will kind of naturally be conveyed, and to whatever degree is already naturally being conveyed in our other meetings. So I just say that to say that there's a lot that I have on my mind besides what we will be specifically going through, but it somewhat relates. So we'll see all what we end up covering exactly, but as is typical of a new moon, there's a lot of ground that could be covered. So basically what we will end up going through is some material from the book known as First Enoch or 1 Enoch, or more popularly, simply the Book of Enoch. However, we will say just calling it the Book of Enoch is insufficient in a number of ways. One reason is that in addition to First Enoch, there's another writing called Second Enoch, and then there's another writing called Third Enoch. So there's actually 3 books of Enoch. And so calling First Enoch the Book of Enoch doesn't quite accurately represent what we have in terms of writings associated with Enoch. But there's another reason why it's insufficient, and that is that the Book of Enoch as we have it, that is 1 Enoch as we have it, is not actually just one literary structure. It's not a monolith. It's not one composition. And we might even call it the Enochic Pentateuch, even though there are other issues with that. But, we think of the Pentateuch of Moses, the Mosaic Pentateuch, and that's the 5 books of Moses. Well, 1 Enoch is actually a compilation, if you will, of 5 main books. But just like with the Pentateuch, that's, saying the Pentateuch of Moses doesn't quite cut it, because it's not actually just written by one author. It's not just 5 separate books, and it's not actually written by Moses. We have a very similar situation with the Book of Enoch. So we kind of have to talk about that a bit. And to begin with, I'll mention some broader things about the Book of Enoch before getting into some of the stuff that we'll more specifically read. So, First Enoch, as I mentioned, is really 5 main books. And most of the manuscripts that we have of First Enoch are written in Ge'ez, the Ethiopian language, otherwise known as Ethiopic. And, a lot of the manuscripts date from the 15th century, 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th, so these are very late manuscripts. I mean, this comes from the time just prior to the Reformation up into more modern times. And so for a long time, people in the West didn't even know about First Enoch. I think they had some sort of knowledge that such a writing existed, but no one actually had the writing. And, I won't go into all the history of how First Enoch became available to people in the West, but there were a few people from the West who ended up traveling to Ethiopia and obtaining copies of First Enoch and bringing them back to the West. And scholars examined these writings, and actually, I will also say that there were other claims about Enoch writings not connected with one Enoch that simply were false. But with one Enoch, when this writing was brought from Ethiopia to the Western world, there was a lot of debate over whether it actually represents an ancient writing prior to the time of Jesus or not. It has this place, which is in 1 Enoch chapter 1, verse 9, which contains the material that Jude attributes to Enoch in the book of Jude in the New Testament, chapter 1, because there's only one chapter, verses 14 and 15. And so people looking at that had to analyze, well, is the book of Enoch that Jude is actually quoting really this Ethiopian book? Or is the Ethiopian book a later creation that happened to include the words that are in Jude, because in order for it to be viewed as authentic, you have to have this quote in it. In other words, did Jude say, oh, this is something that Enoch said, and then later someone wrote a book of Enoch and included that statement in it? Or was the book known as First Enoch actually composed first and then Jude quoted it? So we've talked about all this sort of thing in past studies, and we have one study in particular that I recommend for everyone to listen to if they haven't already, and it's called A Fair Approach to 1 Enoch. And then there are a couple other studies that we have talking about 2 Peter and Jude in relation to that subject, and then there's the broader subject, or in a sense more narrow subject, of Genesis 6, which connects to First Enoch. So on the Seven Angels Messages YouTube channel, you can find all of that. There's a playlist that we have on 1 Enoch where you can find all those studies, or you can just do a search term on the YouTube channel and come up with everything that we have so far on the subject. But basically, any historian, any scholar who has anything to do with this subject nowadays, especially since the 1940s, recognizes that Jude definitely was quoting the book represented by the Ethiopian 1 Enoch. Why do we know that? Because copies of first Enoch were found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, which date before the time of Jesus. So we have the Ethiopian manuscripts. There are actually some Greek manuscripts, but they're very fragmentary. And there is a Latin fragment from the 8th century as well. And then, of course, in the Dead Sea Scrolls, we have the Aramaic documents of one Enoch. Now, one Enoch, as it is in the Ethiopian manuscripts, has these 5 main sections, and in some of the Ethiopian manuscripts, they are actually titled Book 1, Book 2, Book 3, Book 4, Book 5. And so most scholars recognize that, yeah, those were originally separate books, and then they were brought together. So Book 1 is called the Book of the Watchers, and it's in 1 Enoch, chapters 1 to 36. And then we have the Book of the Similitudes, otherwise called the Book of Parables. That's chapters 37 to 71. Then there's the Book of Astronomical Writings, and some of these have other names, like the Book of Heavenly Luminaries, or simply the Book of Luminaries is the same thing as the Book of Astronomical Writings, chapters 72 to 82. The Book of Dream Visions, chapters 83 to 90, and the Epistle of Enoch is 1 Enoch, chapters 91 to 107, although that sometimes includes chapter 108. Some view it as just an appendix, some view it as part of the last book. But those are like the main divisions. But the thing is, that's a little too simple. It actually is not that we just have, well, here's one book written by one person at one time, and that's First Enoch, or the first book of First Enoch, the Book of Watchers. And then there's the Book of Parables, and that's another book, and so on and so forth. These are originally independent writings that went through editorial processes for each independent writing before they were combined together into this 5-book series that we now call 1 Enoch. And in order to put them all together, there was further editing to stitch them all together into one book. And the book that we are going to focus on is the Book of Parables, or the Book of the Similitudes, otherwise called the Parables of Enoch. Although I will mention a little bit more about the book which follows it within the Enochic Pentateuch, which is called the Book of Heavenly Luminaries, or the Astronomical Writing. And in the form in which it is found in the Dead Sea Scrolls, it's called the Aramaic Astronomical Book. And there are several different forms of it in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And again, with the Dead Sea Scrolls, as most Dead Sea Scrolls are, it is fragmentary. But what is really interesting is some of the changes. And I mentioned this just to say, like, this really has gone through some editorial process. And I mention it also for another element that I think is important in general for us to have in mind. So all these different Enoch writings have some similarities to other Jewish writings, but also some major differences. I mean, if you look through the Hebrew Bible, which is pretty much equivalent to the Protestant Old Testament, you don't really have something that is laying out exactly how the calendar works. You have mentions of feast days and new moons and Sabbaths and different things like that. And there's reference to particular dates, a certain month of a certain year and a certain day and so on. But you don't have an explanation of the calendar itself. Whereas in other writings you do. In the book of Jubilees, there's a lot of talking about a calendar, and the book of Jubilees is within the tradition of the book of Enoch, of First Enoch and Second Enoch. However, there's a lot of misunderstanding that people commonly have about the calendars represented within that tradition.
Explain what you mean by it's in the tradition of one Enoch.
Okay, sure. Yes, the tradition of one Enoch. What I mean by that is something similar to what I mean when I talk about the Masoretic tradition or the Septuagint tradition. What we mean is a body of related material that shares a common root in some way. So it's for the Masoretic tradition, it's a textual family. It's a family of manuscripts that all share a common root and are similar to each other, but different from other families of manuscripts like the Septuagint family. And so that's a tradition, a related body of material. The same is true of this tradition that includes the books of Enoch, the book of Jubilees, the testaments of the 12 patriarchs, the Genesis, Apocryphon, and several other writings. All of those stem from a similar tradition. Also coming within that tradition is books like, or at least there's a related tradition that includes the Qumran sectarian literature, like the community rule, the Horeot, or the Thanksgiving hymns, the Odes of Solomon. And I would say more closely related are the Odes of Solomon, the Thanksgiving hymns, the community rule. Those three are very closely related to each other. So is the Gospel of John and the Didache. All those texts relate to each other in very close ways. And all of them also share a relation to books like the Testaments of the 12 Patriarchs, First Enoch, the Book of Jubilees. There's a relation. And, so these are like clusters of texts, and some of them are more distant, but they have a chain of connection between them. So, and it's not to say that you have like one tradition and it's totally independent of another tradition. No, traditions can relate to each other, but still be within a given tradition. So, these Enoch writings are very, very interesting. Like, Second Enoch has a lot of astronomical information, as does First Enoch. And that sort of thing you don't find so much in other ancient Jewish writings. And in fact, Second Enoch doesn't really show any awareness of the Mosaic traditions, the traditions related to Moses. And much of the material in First Enoch doesn't either. Like, there's a lot that's like, it's a very different tradition with very different material. And, like, you can find some ancient Jewish writings that seem to be opposed to dreams and visions and a sense through the heavens and different things like that, whereas that is a main theme in the writings of the Enochic tradition. Now, in the astronomical book, the Aramaic astronomical book, which is kind of the original form of what is in 1st Enoch, chapters 72 to 82, there are a lot of differences between that and the form of that book as it occurs in 1 Enoch in the Ethiopian manuscripts. A lot of people studying the Book of Jubilees and the Book of Enoch think that it presents a solar calendar where the months are determined by the sun rather than by the moon. But in fact, the Book of Jubilees, the Ethiopian Book of Enoch, and the Aramaic Enoch documents present a calendar which uses the sun and the moon. And in the Book of Jubilees, its contention is that some people had, like, it objects to people structuring their years by the moon. Their year has to be determined by the sun. It's not even debating the issue of whether months are governed by the moon or the sun. It's talking about the years, and it objects that if you rule your year by the moon, as in you have 12 lunar cycles, and then you immediately go into the next year, and then another 12, and then another 12, basically, like for an example, the Islamic world has their calendar run in that way. And the objection in the Book of Jubilees to that type of lunar year system is that every year you fall 10 days behind. So you'll continually come 10 days behind, 10 days behind. So you have like 354 days of a year if you govern your year by 12 lunar cycles. And so it says, no, you shouldn't do that. The sun should be governing the years. But it doesn't explain so much about the moon. However, it does talk about new moons in the Book of Jubilees. So it's not objecting to moon-governed months or anything like that. It's objecting to moon-governed years, and talks about how we should have a 364-day calendar rather than a 354-day calendar. And if someone's thinking, oh, wait, no, it's supposed to be actually 365 days, again, it depends how you govern your days, and this gets to kind of complicated astronomical things. The way that the Book of Enoch talks about a day, it's talking about solar days. Whereas if you talk about days, how we view days in modern astronomy, days are not so strictly solar days. A day in modern astronomy is actually, if you take a fixed point on the globe, what you consider a day is when that point is directly facing a distant fixed star, and I forget which star it is that's used in modern astronomy, but it's a fixed star in relation to the Earth, and it's basically one rotation of the Earth where one point points to that fixed star, and then the Earth spins on its axis once all the way around until that same point is directly facing that same fixed star again. So using that system, there's like 365 and a quarter days to a year because it's taking a fixed point on the globe and having that directly face a distant star. Now that's different from a solar day where you take a fixed point on the Earth and have it directly face our own sun. Because if you do that while the Earth is going around the sun, it's not actually making a complete circle every time, because it's not like the Earth is still and the sun is still, and the earth is just spinning and having to make a complete rotation every time to make a full day, the fact that the earth is actually going around the sun while it's spinning means that it does not have to make a complete rotation in order for the same point to be directly facing the sun again. That's a solar day. And the difference between the amount of time it takes for a full year of solar days to take place versus a full day or a full year of stellar days, I think they're called, which is a day where it's facing a distant fixed star, is 1.25 days. So you end up, like with the Enochic calendar, 364 solar days is equal to the modern 365.25 days, where the fixed point on the Earth is directly facing a distant fixed star. So anyway, I just kind of explained that as a footnote in order to keep clear in mind this whole 364-day thing. But don't worry, guys, we're not going to be spending this meeting talking about astronomical details. So here's the thing. The astronomical book that is contained within 1 Enoch, as we have it in the Ethiopian manuscripts, is very much so focused on the movements of the sun. There is stuff that talks about the moon, and even in the Ethiopian manuscripts, the first light on the moon in the lunar cycle is considered the beginning of the month. That marks the first day of the month. So you have a solar month even in Enoch as we have it. But in the Aramaic manuscripts of the Book of Enoch, there's very detailed descriptions of the movements of the moon in the various stages of the month. So it's really clear that it's a lunar month in connection with a solar year in the more ancient writings that are contained in the Book of Enoch. But here's the thing. The earliest manuscripts of the astronomical book in the Dead Sea Scrolls is basically a scientific manuscript. It's not set really in a literary context. It's not set within a story. It's basically just a scientific document which accurately describes real observations of the movements of the moon. Now, of course, this is from a perspective of the Earth. So it's not like modern astronomy. But still, like even in modern astronomy, there's kind of like amateur astronomy, which is called naked eye astronomy, which is just using your own eyes and looking and making observations. And this, of course, is how all astronomy was done prior to Galileo. And, modern scholars in connection with astronomers studying the Aramaic astronomical book have found that, yes, even though it's not modern astronomy, it does contain real observations. And so obviously these Jews who were writing these books, or whoever it was writing this book, was interested in making observations about the natural world and recording them, and was really doing a form of science, even though the modern scientific method had not yet been developed. There was an interest, and it can be referred to as an ancient science. Now, it's really interesting that ancient Jewish scientific literature, we mostly just have that from the Dead Sea Scrolls. Is that to say that that community was more interested in science and scientifically literate than others? Perhaps. But within this Enochic tradition, there is a greater focus on cosmology, astronomy, meteorology, the natural sciences. There's definitely an interest taken in that, and it is often viewed in symbolic ways, which we'll get to. And just to give you an example of this, Psalm 19, the heavens declare the glory of God, etc., etc. People often view that as, there's all these, it's just so amazing how vast the universe is and how, look, God made all this. It's so amazing. That's usually how people view that, to say how great a God we must have who made such a vast universe and all of that, which, of course, in the ancient world, they didn't realize that the universe was a big place. So that's not what the author of Psalm 19 was referring to. But even if you grant that the author of Psalm 19 was not referring to a vast universe, you might still say, well, within the ancient understanding of a dome sky and these fixed stars and maybe multiple skies that move, so you have some stars that move and rotate and so on, you might still view it as, well, the way in which the heavens declare the glory of God is because they were made by God, and it must have been such a magnificent being to have made all that. That's not actually what Psalm 19 is saying. Psalm 19 is saying that the heavens silently declare the glory of God by representing things about God. So when you read Psalm 19, it's one of its primary points of focus is actually the sun, and it talks about the course of the sun, going from one end of heaven to another. And I'll just read it here, and I'll read from the Anchor Yale translation. The heavens are proclaiming the glory of God, and the sky manifests the work of his hands. Day unto day pours forth speech, and night unto night unfolds knowledge. So it's unfolding knowledge. Without speech and without words, without their voice being heard, through all the earth their call went forth, and their words to the edge of the world. To the sun he gave a tent. Then, like a bridegroom, it goes forth from its bower, rejoicing like a warrior to run its course. From the edge of the heavens is its going forth, and its return is to their edge, never turning aside from its pavilion. So notice, it's not turning aside, it's running its course, so it's talking about order. But then this is what it says, verse 8. The law of Yahweh is perfect, refreshing my soul. The decree of Yahweh is stable, giving my mind wisdom. The precepts of Yahweh are direct, rejoicing my heart. The command of Yahweh is radiant, enlightening my eyes. The edict of Yahweh is pure, enduring forever. The judgments of Yahweh are truth. All of them are just, more desirable than gold, and much fine gold, and sweeter than honey, honey from the comb. Indeed, your servant is enlightened by them. In observing them, there is great reward. Who can understand errors? From my aberrations cleanse me. Above all, keep your servant from the presumptuous ones, lest they rule over me. Then shall I be blameless and innocent of the great crime. May the words of my mouth be according to your desire, and the thoughts of my heart according to your will. O Yahweh, my mountain and my Redeemer. So that's the end of Psalm 19. So if we were to take the time to go through this in more detail, it would become abundantly clear that what's happening is that the first half of the psalm, verses 1 to 7, are thematically paralleling the second half, verses 8 to 15. And what's happening is that in the first half, it's talking about the heavens, and with a particular focus on the sun. And then the second half draws a parallel between that and the Word of God, the instructions, the decree, the law of God. And just like the sun lightens the day, just so the law of God enlightens my eyes. Okay, so it's drawing a parallel between the sun and the law, and the order of the heavens, and how the heavens move in order and repeat, and the heavenly bodies do not depart from their paths, but are organized and stable and consistent and reliable, just so the Word of God is reliable and consistent, and so on and so forth. So it's actually drawing an analogy from the heavens as to how the law of God is. The attributes of the heavens are shared by the law of God, and that's the way in which the heavens are declaring the glory of God in Psalm 19. Now, in the Enochic writings, that is done even more so, where particular heavenly bodies represent particular things, and there's a more detailed symbolism with the heavenly bodies. And this is perhaps even more so in the earlier manuscripts of the Book of Enoch. However, the very earliest, to my knowledge, are strictly scientific. Now, there is a brilliance in the Enochic literature. Like, it's really detailed. There's a lot of thorough understanding. The various writers who contributed to this tradition clearly were intelligent people. And some of this, I kind of want to pause for a moment there and just say, we need to take on some of the mindset of some of these ancient writers, and they were operating on a higher level. Some of these guys who are writing these Enochic writings, they were very much so interested in viewing the world from a higher sphere. Their attention was focused on the heavens. And some of them made very careful studies of the heavens to try and understand the cycles of the heavenly bodies from a very scientific perspective, as much as could be, before the kind of spelling out of the scientific method. And some of them studied the heavens in order to understand allegorically how that relates to things on the earth. And then some of them went beyond that, and some had visionary experiences and had messages that related to the heavens. In any case, though, these were people who had a high standard of thought and a high standard of righteousness, and the Enochic writings emphasize righteousness a lot. So, anyway, what we will kind of direct our attention to now is the book known as the Book of Parables, the Book of Similitudes, or the Parables of Enoch. Now, there are a number of reasons why this writing should be interesting to us. Again, it's a distinct writing from the other writings. And just like we've been talking about when looking at the community rule, we can't just take the writings of one author and judge another author's writings by what the first author had to say. That's not just. That's not an honest way to read and judge things. So, The Book of Enoch, I will have to say, though, is easier than something like the Community Rule, because in the manuscripts we actually have Book 1, Book 2, etc., etc. So that makes it easier. And then also within the manuscripts, it's a bit easier because it's narrative and it talks about, persons, and it's easier to distinguish. Like, there are a number of things to notify us when there's been some editing that might be less apparent in the Community Rule. So, for instance, let's just take the very first part of the very first book in 1 Enoch. So, the Book of Enoch, chapter 1, verse 1. The blessing of Enoch, with which he blessed the elect and the righteous who would be present on the day of tribulation at the time of the removal of all the ungodly ones. Okay, well, looking at that, it's quite apparent that whoever wrote that was not claiming to be Enoch. Those are not claimed to be the words of Enoch. It speaks of Enoch in third person, the blessing of Enoch, with which he blessed the elect, etc., etc. Okay, well, you keep reading in the Book of Enoch, and you come across stuff that sounds like it's Enoch talking. So, like, okay, Enoch, 1 Enoch 12, verse 3. And I, Enoch, began to bless the Lord of the mighty ones and the King of the universe. Okay, so that's like Enoch speaking in first person. And then chapter 13, verse 1. As for Enoch, he proceeded and said to Azazel, etc., etc. Okay, so there's a lot of back and forth between first person Enoch and third person Enoch. And it's kind of, a lot to sort through and all of that, but at least there's a way to sort through it, because some places it's just speaking of Enoch in third person, some places in first person, and there's multiple explanations for that. But then when we get to the Parables of Enoch, we have somewhat of a different situation. And this is what we have. The Parables of Enoch starts in 1 Enoch, chapter 37. This is what it says. The vision of wisdom that Enoch saw, the son of Jared, the son of Mahalalel, the son of Kenan, the son of Enosh, the son of Seth, the son of Adam. That's verse 1. Verse 2. This is the beginning of the words of wisdom, which I took up to recount to those who dwell on the earth. Okay, so first you have this introductory clause, the vision of wisdom that Enoch saw. Well, that doesn't claim to be written by Enoch. That is written in third person about Enoch. And then verse 2 is written with the first person pronoun I. But here's the thing, it does not say, this is the beginning of the words of wisdom which I, Enoch, took up to recount to those who dwell on the earth. So if you go through, basically if you study the Parables of Enoch, which is 1 Enoch chapters 37 to 71, there are places where there are interpolations with later aspects that have been edited in, additions to the text. If you remove all that, and if you remove all the editorial stuff that seeks to tie this book, the Parables of Enoch, with the previous books and the books which follow within the Enoch Pentateuch, that is 1 Enoch, there's nothing in the Parables of Enoch which actually claims to be written by Enoch. Every indication, so far as I can see, is that it's written anonymously, the original writing, and then someone thought, well, this is written by Enoch. We're going to incorporate it into this body of Enochic literature. That's one Enoch. And then these editorial phrases were put in that says, the vision of wisdom that Enoch saw. And it's actually pretty easy to tell. It's not like it's really complicated. You can tell because it all of a sudden will switch from first person to third person. So, you read in the Parable of Enoch, and then, verse 1 of chapter 37 is the first verse, and it's clearly third person, refers to Enoch. And then you go back to third person in chapter 39, verse 1. It says, in those days, the sons of the chosen and holy were descending from the highest, and their seed was becoming one with the sons of men. In those days, Enoch received books of jealous wrath and rage, and books of trepidation and consternation. Okay, well, that's like suddenly switching from first person and totally like jumping out of the context to a third person statement where it's now speaking about Enoch, and then it switches back to the first person, and it doesn't claim to be written by Enoch again. So it's like an editor came along and added all these little phrases that are like headings and titles, which really is just explaining their understanding, whether right or wrong, that this writing was written by Enoch. But when you just take all that was part of the original writing, there's nothing indicating that it was written by Enoch or that it claimed to have been written by Enoch. But there are several things in this writing which are very interesting for us for a number of reasons. And I'll explain what some of those things are. Within this Parables of Enoch writing, and I hesitate to call it the Parables of Enoch because it's not actually the Parables of Enoch. It is parables, but we don't know who really wrote it. But the way that the original writing started is found in 1 Enoch 37, verse 2. It says, "This is the beginning of the words of wisdom." So we could call it the Parables of the Words of Wisdom, or just the Words of Wisdom, something like that. So this writing is really interesting in a number of different ways. Most scholars believe that this writing is the latest of the various Enochic writings that were included in 1st Enoch. Some of the manuscripts go back to the 3rd century BCE, perhaps even earlier, of the astronomical book. And that the astronomical book may be the earliest of the Enochic writings. And then others, in fact, all of the other 5 sections of 1 Enoch, so the other 4 sections, excluding this one, fragments of it were found among the Dead Sea Scrolls. No fragments of this one were found among the Dead Sea Scrolls. Does that mean that the Qumran community did not have it? Not necessarily, because however much of the Dead Sea Scrolls didn't make it. So its absence does not mean that they didn't have it. It just means that it wasn't preserved. However, it's possible that they didn't have it. We don't have proof that they did. That said, it certainly has parallels, a lot of very interesting and close parallels to other writings, such as the Community Rule and so on. And so there's a connection. In fact, some of the paradigms that are expressed within the sectarian literature from the Dead Sea Scrolls are also expressed here. Most historians place the writing of this book in the latter part of the 1st century BCE or the first part, like the first couple decades of the 1st century of the Common Era. So just before the ministry of Jesus, whether by a decade or 2 decades or 50 years or whatever it may be, something like that. But, within the 70 or 50 or whatever years, it's not totally clear how to date it, but, scholars have arguments about this. But basically the consensus right now is that it's in the time just prior to the ministry of Jesus, whether that's a matter of years or decades or half a century or a little bit more. Most wouldn't place it much more than that, and most wouldn't place it after that. I'm telling you this as the scholarly consensus. I'm not promoting that as gospel truth. It's something to be studied out. However, in reading this, I don't know of anything that conflicts with that hypothesis, and there are some things that seem to make sense with that. The reason why is because if you study like the Thanksgiving hymns and the community rule, and you study the New Testament, you see a lot of parallels, a lot of ideas that are in the sectarian writings that are picked up in the New Testament. The same is true with the book of Enoch. There's a lot in the Parables of Enoch in particular. I'll just focus on that for now. There's a lot in the parables that are picked up in the New Testament which are not in the Qumran sectarian writings either. And so it kind of looks like this. Like, you have elements that are not in the Qumran sectarian writings that are in the Book of Enoch, which you might expect to be in the Qumran sectarian writings if the Parables of Enoch came first and if they accepted it. But it's not there. And why is that? But these unique and prominent ideas from the sectarian writings, like the light-darkness paradigm and all that, that shows up in the Parables of Enoch. But then there's other stuff that shows up, which shows up in the New Testament. And one of the main things is the Son of Man, the idea of the Son of Man, and the things that are said about the Son of Man in the Parables of Enoch that do not show up in other writings anywhere other than in the New Testament. So if you read the Gospels in the New Testament, Jesus is called the Son of Man repeatedly. That's like his own self-designation. It's like he views it as a prophetic title which he is fulfilling. So he talks about, when the Son of Man sits upon his throne, there will be these 12 thrones that will be given to you, his 12 disciples. Well, he's clearly talking about himself as being the Son of Man. He says the Son of Man has no place to lay his head. So there's like this self-understanding of this prophetic title that he viewed as applying to him. Or at minimum, the gospel authors portray Jesus as viewing that title as applying to him, which I don't think is unrealistic at all. However, there is debate over the Son of Man's sayings. In any case, this writing, let's just forget that it's even part of the Book of Enoch for a minute, and let's just view it as its own independent writing, not viewing it as claiming to be written by Enoch, and let's see what it has to say. And as you'll see, this is a remarkable writing. Like, just think about what you know of the New Testament. Think of what you know about the present message. And we're going to just start reading through it. We won't get through the whole thing. There are 3 parables, and we will probably get through the first one and part of the second one, or at least that's the goal. And even in order to do that, we're going to have to probably skip through a lot. So we won't go through this in like a whole lot of detail, but I will read it and comment on some things as we go. For sake of time, this can't be like a super detailed study, but I encourage you guys all to study this on your own. But just for now, take it as something that we're reading, and here's the idea to have in mind for you to test. So this is a writing written sometime after the Qumran sectarian stuff, so after the teacher of righteousness, but before the time of Jesus, written by an individual who claimed to have inspiration and who had a great influence on Jesus. See if that holds up. So let's have that in mind and now consider what this has to say. And I'm sure in addition to seeing things that connect with Jesus in his earthly ministry, you will also see things that connect with Jesus in his heavenly ministry, in particular things that we know of in the branch message. And that will be even more so the case when we get to the second parable. So, I will end up skipping certain portions which were clearly not part of this writing. And we'll refer to this writing as the beginning of the words of wisdom, because in the ancient world, they considered the first word or first words of a text to be their title. That's typically how they did it. So, this is the beginning of the words of wisdom. Now, this was originally written in Hebrew or Aramaic, and the word beginning is Rosh, which is not always referring to the beginning temporally, but the first in importance. So it's like, the beginning of the word of wisdom, that type of phrase occurs a lot in the Hebrew Bible. You'll read something like, "Oh, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom," or it's like the principal thing. It's the summit of wisdom, or something is being the most important of a given thing, and it's referred to as being the head of something, the beginning of something. So, and that's the word Rosh in Hebrew is head. So this is the beginning of the words of wisdom, or this is the head of the words of wisdom, like the most important, the first thing you need to know in terms of the words of wisdom. This is the beginning of the words of wisdom, which I took up to recount to those who dwell on the earth. Listen, you first ones, and look, you who come after, the words of the Holy One, which I speak in the presence of the Lord of spirits. So here, the words of wisdom are considered the words of the Holy One. Wisdom is a point of emphasis in this writing, and she is spoken of as a she is spoken of as a being. We'll get to that a little bit later. But these are the words of wisdom which this individual spoke in the presence of the Lord of spirits. Spirits isn't the best word. We should say either the Lord of breathers or the Lord of living ones or even the Lord of winds. But it's definitely talking about living beings, and we'll get to that more later as well. But just for one reference, later there is a parallel to Isaiah 6:3 where it's holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts, with the Seraphim crying that out in Isaiah 6:3. There's a parallel to that here in chapter 39, verse 12, which says, holy, holy, holy is the Lord of spirits. He fills the earth with his spirits rather than he fills the earth with his glory. Well, here spirits is referring to living beings, the hosts. Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. So these are the angelic hosts, the angels, or we can just call them the living ones. So we will, where it says Lord of spirits in some translations, we will read Lord of living ones. We could say Lord of breathers, but that might come across as saying anything that breathes. But clearly it's talking about the angelic hosts, and so we'll say the Lord of living ones. So listen, you first ones, and look, you who come after. So it's understanding this message to be proclaimed. There will be those who hear it first and then those who hear it afterward. And what are they supposed to listen to? To the words of wisdom, the words of the Holy One, which I, whoever this messenger was, spoke in the presence of the Lord of living ones. So this individual is claiming to speak words of wisdom, the words of the Holy One, while this is claiming inspiration. They are not his own words or her own words. They are the words of the Holy One, the words of wisdom. Verse 3, it is profitable to speak these things to those who are first, and from those who come after let us not withhold the head of wisdom, or the beginning of wisdom. Until now, there had not been given from the presence of the Lord of living ones such wisdom as I have received according to my insight, according to the good pleasure of the Lord of living ones, by whom the lot of everlasting life was given to me. So what's this person saying? And I don't know if it's male or female. Maybe for ease, we'll just use generic masculine language, understanding that maybe male, maybe female. But this messenger, what he's saying here is that he's speaking words that are the words of wisdom. He's claiming to proclaim this message that is the words of wisdom, the words of the Holy One, that were given to him from the presence of the Lord of living ones. So he claims to have been in the presence of the Lord of living ones and to receive the message that's the words of wisdom. And he says that until now, there has never been given such words. I'll read this again. Until now, there had not been given from the presence of the Lord of living ones such wisdom as I have received according to my insight, according to the good pleasure of the Lord of living ones. Now, where it says, according to my insight, that is so much like the language of the teacher of righteousness. I'm not saying this was written by the teacher of righteousness. I don't know of any indication that it was, although, of course, wouldn't be wrong to ask the question. But if most scholars are right and this was written after the time of the teacher of righteousness, then, it wouldn't, of course, be written by the teacher of righteousness. And there are themes and ideas that are contained here, as we will see, that are not contained in any of the Qumran sectarian literature. So that's something to take into account. But this is quite the claim. I mean, this should be exciting for us, right? Because so much of what we read that we thought, oh, well, this is inspired, we find out, oh, man, we can't even find a clear claim to inspiration. So, like, the writings in the Pentateuch, we can't find a clear claim to inspiration. Matthew, Mark, Luke, we can't find a clear claim to inspiration. there's a lot of writings, Kings, Chronicles, 1st and 2nd Samuel, Ruth, Esther, Joshua, Judges, like basically the majority of the Old Testament and several writings in the New Testament make no clear claim to inspiration. And so since we are interested in inspiration, since we want a message from the divine, we want to know what our Heavenly Family has to say to us, it's awesome to come across something that claims to be a product of inspiration. Again, even the first part, the Book of the Watchers in 1 Enoch, it speaks of Enoch in third person. Whoever wrote it is like a narrator telling about Enoch and saying, well, Enoch said this, and then goes into first person Enoch for a while. But, the narrator, whoever wrote that, isn't claiming to be Enoch, and with any indication, I don't know of anything that indicates that they were claiming inspiration. So it's always something that should catch our attention when we read something where there's a claim to inspiration. Doesn't mean that because there's a claim that the claim is true. It still has to be tested. But it's really fascinating and important to say, okay, here's something that should catch our attention. This person is claiming to bear a message from the divine. And it's actually a more narrow spectrum from that because, there are ancient texts where prophets claim to bear a message from gods that are not Yahweh and gods that are even opposed to Yahweh. So just claiming inspiration from a particular god or gods isn't really what we're looking for. I don't really want to focus on and certainly not believe a message given from, let's say Belial to some prophet of Belial, or from Baal, or whoever it may be, Marduk. I don't really want the message of Marduk. I want the message of Yahweh. I want the message of wisdom. And this claims to be the words of wisdom, the words of the Holy One from the Lord of the living ones. So this is at least claiming to come from the right divine beings, claiming to come from wisdom who gave us this present message, which is a message which is all about freeing this world from selfishness and sinfulness and bringing about a better world. That's what this is all about, and that's what we want. We don't want a message from a God who says, look, I made you as my slaves. Give me my offerings, and I will save you from, in battle in this particular war or whatever. That's kind of some of the stuff that you find from other gods, where other gods are seeking to instill fear in others and don't really care about what their subjects do in terms of moral behavior. The other gods of the nations really just wanted slaves. They wanted their subjects to be their slaves and to bring them offerings and all this sort of thing. That's not how our Heavenly Family is. That's one of the major differences between our Heavenly Family and the other gods. So here, so far, the claim is at least in line with our Heavenly Family and in line with truth. And what's so interesting is that this person is saying that the message that they were receiving was the height of wisdom that had been given in Revelation up to that time. Until now, there has not been given from the presence of the Lord of living ones such wisdom as I have received according to my insight. Now that makes sense, right? You would expect Revelation to progress. Just like we've been saying today in this message, wow, we have had such an outpouring of wisdom within this few years period of time that is really greater than anything that we have received up till now. Victor Hodder talks about this too. He says that present truth always takes precedent. It doesn't erase former truths. It doesn't, overshadow former truths to the point where they don't matter or anything like that. No, it's just that its importance is so much higher. Ellen White conveys the same general idea where she says, it is present truth that the flock needs now. But, this guy, whoever wrote this, is saying something a little bit more. He's saying, this is really, something above and beyond what we have received. So this claim that he made in his generation is parallel to the claim that this message makes in this generation. This is saying, yes, this message is really taking things to a whole new level. It is going above and beyond what we have received from the past messages. And if you view the messages as taking you up a number of feet, like let's say going from the first angel's message to the second angel's message took you from, sea level to up a foot, and then the second angel's message took you up another foot, and you keep going, and each message might take you up. Like the third angel's message, you jumped up 50 feet, and then the rod message is like jumping up 100 feet. Branch message jumping up another 100 feet or 150 or 200 or whatever, and each message is taking you up a little higher, a little higher. We claim that this message is shooting you up in a rocket far above the messages that came prior to it. That's kind of like the claim that the author of this text is making. Until now, we've never received such wisdom. Such wisdom as we receive in this had not been given. This is something above and beyond. This is like the head of the words of wisdom, like the supreme truths. So it's making a large claim. It's like, wow, this should really draw our attention. Verse 5, 3 parables were imparted to me. I took them up and spoke to those who dwell on the earth. Now it moves to chapter 38, verse 1. The first parable, that's what it says. Now that, maybe the original author said that, but it could also just be a later title within the text. Like someone said, okay, well, this is the first parable. When the congregation of the righteous appears, the sinners are judged for their sins, and from the face of the earth they are driven. Okay, so the congregation of the righteous appears, and that brings about the judgment of sin and sinners, and the driving away of sinners from the face of the earth. Now, this sort of thing is very parallel to Psalm 68, Psalm 1, and also 1QS column 8. Remember, in 1QS column 8, even though we haven't studied it in depth yet, it talks about a community being established, like a core group within the community of 12 and 3, and how they will atone and bring about the final wiping away of sin and all that. Well, here it says, when the congregation of the righteous appears, the sinners are judged for their sins, and from the face of the earth they are driven. Okay, so that is very similar in concept to what we read in the Qumran sectarian literature as to how sin becomes wiped away. That's what we find in some of the Psalms. That's what this message has been saying from the beginning. Okay, so far so good. Verse 2. And when the righteous one appears in the presence of the righteous, whose chosen works depend on the Lord of living ones, and a light appears to the righteous and chosen who dwell on the earth, where will be the dwelling place of the sinners? And where will be the resting place of those who have denied the Lord of living ones? It will be better for them if they had not been born. Okay, so here we have an appearance of the righteous one. Some manuscripts say, instead of saying when the righteous one appears, it says when righteousness appears. So that's a variant, but later it does talk about the righteous one. So it may be originally that it's the righteous one who's appearing. If it's not the righteous one who's appearing, it's righteousness which appears in the presence of the righteous, whose chosen works depend on the Lord of living ones. So here you have either righteousness or the righteous one appearing in the presence of the righteous, whose chosen works depend on the Lord of living ones. So they're not depending on themselves for their good works. Their good works depend on someone else. So they are operating on this higher level, right? They're not all stuck in a rut and behaving with their own feeble efforts to reform their lives and all of that. No. These ones are depending on the Lord of living ones. You know, when they come into temptation, they're depending on, and I'll move it forward to our terminology, depending on our heavenly family. And a light appears to the righteous and chosen who dwell on the earth. So they have righteousness and they have light. When this takes place, where will be the dwelling place of the sinners? So it's saying, like, obviously it's trying to point out, the question is rhetorical. Where will be the dwelling place of sinners when this takes place? Where will be the resting place of those who have denied the Lord of spirits? They won't have a resting place. It would have been better for them if they had not been born, is what it says. So it's basically pointing out, look, when a congregation of righteousness arises, that's the end game. That's the day when the wicked will be separated. This is the day that we understand to be the judgment for the living. Now, there are other things later which we'll get to this, but this is describing these things as they occur on earth. As a side note, and I won't read it for sake of time, but there are parallels to this in the New Testament. So, you know, the phrase, it would have been better for them if they had not been born, that's in Matthew 26, verse 24. And Jesus refers to those who deny the Son of Man. And it would have been better for them if they had not been born. Well, that language is so tied into this writing, which is embedded in 1 Enoch. In this writing, we have this phrase, it would have been better for them if they had not been born, and it's in connection with the righteous one, and the righteous one later in this writing is identified as the Son of Man, as we will see. So going to verse 3, when his hidden things, and his in this context is referring to the Lord of living ones, when his hidden things are revealed to the righteous, the sinners will be judged, and the wicked will be driven from the presence of the righteous and chosen. So prior to that, the righteous and the wicked were somewhat intermingled, but there will be a time when light is revealed to the righteous. Hidden things are revealed to them. So verse 3 it says hidden things. Verse 2 it referred to it as light, and the righteous one appearing to them. When this happens, there's this separation. So the introduction of truth and the mysteries of God causes a separation where the wicked are driven from the presence of the righteous. So I will make a very Hotefian observation. Hotef always liked to point out when it was wicked separated from the righteous, rather than righteous separated from the wicked. The reason why is because it's implying that the group as a whole is viewed as the righteous, or at least those who profess righteousness, and the wicked are separated from their midst, showing that it's the professed people of God, rather than righteous being called out from among the wicked, as it would be in a circumstance where the predominant social setting is those who do not profess to be followers of God, and righteous people are called out from among them. No, this is talking about among God's people, a separation. So the judgment for the living among God's people. So I'll read verse 3 again and go into verse 4. When his hidden things are revealed to the righteous, the sinners will be judged, and the wicked will be driven from the presence of the righteous and chosen. And thereafter it will not be the mighty and exalted who possess the land, and they will not be able to look at the face of the holy, for the light of the Lord of spirits will have appeared on the face of the holy, righteous, and chosen. Then the kings and mighty will perish, and they will be given into the hand of the righteous and holy. And from then on, no one will seek mercy for them from the Lord of spirits, for their life will be at an end. So this is talking about the judgment of the kings and mighty. So notice it talks about a revelation to the righteous, the wicked separated from them, and thereafter the mighty and exalted will no longer possess the land, and they will not be able to look at the faces of the holy, for the light of the Lord of spirits will have appeared on the face of the holy, righteous, and chosen. Okay, so for anyone who has been reading branch literature and keeping up to date with present truth, especially if you've been reading Doug's writings, man, that sounds just like the first deliverance, right? I mean, Ellen White's first vision even, the 140,000, their faces shining with the glory, the light of the Lord, as Moses' face shone, and so on and so forth, and the deliverance, the voice of God, the Assyrian being frightened from the ensign, and so on and so forth, and the kings of the mighty no longer being able to possess the land. This is all just like what we've understood in regard to the deliverance. And the sequence here is, again, just as we have understood, a revelation of light that produces a people of righteousness, which ends up bringing about the separation of sinners from the righteous. Thereafter, the mighty no longer being in possession of the land. I'm going to have to hang up and call back in because we're almost at the hour-and-a-half point, and that's when our calling card cuts out. So I'm going to do that, and then I'll come on again, and we're going to have to fast-track through some things. So be right back. Okay, so we are back now. Thank you guys for your patience. So this, so far, in this parable written by this individual, whoever he was, is declaring the ending of sin, the judgment for the living, and the overthrow of the kings and mighty, and how they will no longer be in possession of the land, and so on. So these are themes with which we are already familiar in this message. And, of course, whoever wrote this had the same idea that we have concerning these things. Now, the next part is considered 1 Enoch chapter 39, verse 1 and 2, and I read that a little earlier, and it's clearly an editorial insertion where it switches to third-person narrative language and refers to Enoch, and it really doesn't make sense in the context. Like, think of what we just read. And then it says, in those days, sons of the chosen and holy were descending from the highest heaven, and their seed was becoming one with the sons of men. In those days, Enoch received books of jealous wrath and rage and books of trepidation and consternation. Okay, so that makes no sense in the context. It switches from referring to the future and referring to the future using first-person language, as in an individual is speaking who received this revelation of something to take place in the future, and then all of a sudden it switches to a third-person narrative referring to in those days as though they are in the past, such and such a thing happened, and Enoch received books, and it's like, it just totally does not make sense. So the next thing is continuing on in a lot better context from what came before. So moving to chapter 39, verse 3. Here it says, in those days, referring to the days in which this individual received these revelations, which are the beginning of the words of wisdom and this magnificent revelation, a cloud and a whirlwind snatched me up from the face of the earth and set me down within the confines of heaven. So this is a visionary experience of being caught up to heaven and seeing however many things. And remember, this is a parable now, right? And it says, and there I saw the dwellings of the holy ones and the resting place of the righteous. There my eyes saw their dwellings with his righteous angels and their resting place with the holy ones. Okay, so that shows you where he says that their dwellings with his righteous angels and with the holy ones and so on, shows that the dwellings of the holy ones and the resting place of the righteous is not referring to angels. It's talking about human beings. And their dwelling place, it's viewing their dwelling place as being in heaven, their heavenly abodes with the angels. And they were petitioning and interceding and were praying for the children of men. And righteousness was flowing like water before them, and mercy like dew upon the earth. Thus it is among them forever and ever. There are parallels, by the way, between that last part and a section in the community rule in 1QS column 11, line 5, which I won't read right now for sake of time. And in that place, my eyes saw the chosen one of righteousness and faith. So the chosen one of righteousness and faith. And this phrase occurs throughout this writing. And righteousness will be his days. That's very similar to what we read in Jeremiah 23, verses 5 and 6 concerning the branch, who is the Lord our righteousness, and righteousness will be in his days, and so on and so forth. So this is very similar to that. There's actually several places throughout this where there is parallels to prophecies in Isaiah and so on that refer to the branch. And the righteous and chosen will be without number before him forever and ever. And you'll notice that several times. Remember, this is written before the New Testament, and there are definitely parallels to this writing within the book of Revelation. And this whole thing of without number is definitely paralleled in Revelation. And I saw his dwelling, again, the dwelling of the chosen one, beneath the wings of the Lord of living ones. And all the righteous and chosen were mighty before him, like fiery lights. So the righteous and chosen were mighty before him, like fiery lights. So remember that how it says that the righteous and chosen will be without number? Well, of course, that's like Revelation 7:9, the great multitude, right? All nations without number. But it's also like the covenant to Abraham, how his seed would be without number as the stars of heaven. Well, here you have the righteous and chosen were mighty before him like fiery lights. You know, fiery lights. In Enochic literature, lightning is described as fiery light, and so are stars. And so here, it's planting little seeds that later will be picked up, where the righteous and chosen are actually being pictured as stars. And even though for us, we recognize that there is a huge difference between stars and lightning, in the ancient world, they did not see such great a difference, because it'd be nighttime and you'd have these bright things in the sky, which they called stars, and then sometimes there'd be a storm at night and there'd be this shooting down of light that looks like the light of a star, and it's shooting down to earth. So stars and lightning were connected in the ancient understanding. So here they're fiery lights, and it's like lightning. And I reference you all to our studies on Isaiah 6. And we have a study on YouTube called The Mystery of the Seraphim, which goes through this in quite some detail. How, like, there's a chain of connections in several scriptures which show that in certain instances, God's people are represented as being lightning and moving like lightning. And that's also connected to seraphim, and it's also connected to stars. Also, Psalm 7 we have a study on Psalm 7, Cush the Benjamite, which also bears connection to this. So anyway, these righteous and chosen ones were mighty before him like fiery lights, and their mouths were full of blessing, and their lips praised the name of the Lord of living ones. And righteousness did not fail before him, nor did truth fail before him. Righteousness and truth, boy, those are words that we sure use a lot. Those are really our points of emphasis. And that's what we find here as well. Righteousness and truth. Righteousness and truth are not the things which most people in the ancient world would connect with their gods. Maybe power, maybe, a storm, and different gods had different things connected with them, fertility, war, and so on. But the gods of Israel have righteousness and truth connected with them. So try and get the picture of this. This is very pictorial. It's portraying an image. So you have this dwelling place, and he's seeing in this vision the dwelling place of the righteous, and they're with the holy angels, and the angels are interceding for the children of men. And before them, the angels and the dwelling places of the righteous, righteousness flows like water, mercy like dew on the earth. And then in that place he saw the chosen one of righteousness and faith, whoever this is. So, of course, we want to try and connect this with everything else that we know, right? But let's not do that yet. But just think of this. This is a writing definitely from before the time of Jesus, and it's talking about how you have the Lord of living ones, and there's this chosen one of righteousness and faith. And he's viewed in heaven. And with him there are righteous and chosen without number. And his dwelling place, the dwelling place of this chosen one, is beneath the wings of the Lord of living ones. And all the righteous and chosen were before him like fiery lights. Their mouths were full of blessing and praise. So here they are, they're praising, and righteousness did not fail before him. Truth did not fail before him. This is like a place of praise and truth and unity and love and righteousness. So naturally, our visionary says in verse 8, "There I wished to dwell, and my spirit longed for that dwelling. There my lot had been before, for thus it has been established concerning me in the presence of the Lord of living ones. In those days I praised and exalted the name of the Lord of living ones with blessing and praise, for he has established me for blessing and praise according to the good pleasure of the Lord of living ones." So he's saying that his lot belonged there. So he's seen this in vision, and he's recognizing it as something where it's like, my lot has already been established there. For thus it has been established concerning me in the presence of the Lord of living ones. Well, that's just like the very first part of this vision, where he talks about how the Lord of living ones had given him this revelation, which is wisdom unlike had ever been before. And the Lord of living ones he refers to as the one by whom the lot of everlasting life was given to me. And that he received in the presence of the Lord of spirits, or the Lord of living ones. And that's what he's seeing now. So he recognizes that what he's seeing is the place where he belongs. So going to verse 10, he says, "And for a long time my eyes looked at that place, and I blessed him and praised him, saying, Blessed is he, and may he be blessed from the beginning and forever. In his presence there is no ceasing," or no ending. It lasts forever. The things which he deals with are things that last forever. He knew before the age was made what would last forever, and for all the generations that will be. So it's a wonderful vision that he's seeing. He's seeing something that is really beautiful and wonderful, something that I would imagine that any of us and all of us would want to be a part of, dwelling underneath the wings, as it were. And again, he does say it's a parable, so it's not like we're to view the Lord of living ones as actually having wings under which everyone's dwelling. But, you take someone under your wing, and it's just a beautiful, beautiful picture. Now, once we get to verse 12, the language kind of changes a bit, and I'm not sure if this is a product of editing or what, but all of a sudden it switches like this. So far it's like the author is speaking to his audience. This is what I saw. I was taken here. And it's just speaking as telling the experience. But now it says, "Those who sleep not bless you, and they stand in the presence of your glory." So it's like speaking to the Lord of living ones. Well, earlier it says, And I blessed him and praised him, saying, Blessed is he, and may he be blessed from the beginning and forever. Well, there it has him blessing and praising God, but even then he's speaking about God in third person in his praises. So it could be that this is just switching to the praises being spoken to God from this individual still within the visionary experience. That's possible, but it doesn't specify that. It doesn't say, and then I said, quote, and then gives this. It just suddenly goes into speaking in second person to God. So maybe there's more to be discovered concerning that. Anyway, it continues on. It says, and they bless and praise and exalt, saying, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of living ones. He fills the earth with living ones. Well, that's like, holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. He fills the earth with his glory. That's like Isaiah 6, verse 3. But here is the Lord of living ones who fills the earth with living ones. So this is quite interesting because it's not like it's saying that God's essence is filling all things. No, it's the Lord of hosts, the Lord of living ones, who fills the earth with living ones. In other words, the beings being specified, the hosts of God's kingdom, are sent throughout the earth. Not God himself, but these living ones. And they're praising him. So this visionary individual continues and says, and there my eyes saw those who sleep not. They stand in his presence, and they bless and say, Blessed are you, and blessed is the name of the Lord forever and ever. And my face was changed, for I was unable to see. That's seems like an odd statement, but in the context it seems like he's saying that he was unable to see things beyond that, and then his face changed to enable him to see, and then it moves on. But these couple verses here, it's possible that they are an interpolation, so an insertion of something else, because the context going from before this to what comes right after follows just as well. So there are unknowns in this passage. But now it goes on to describe other things in this heavenly scene. So again, what are we seeing? We're seeing the dwelling of the righteous. We're seeing the place of the angels. There's the place of the chosen one, which is right there in the presence of the Lord of living ones. And then right by them are those who sleep not. And then right after that, there are the 4 archangels and the thousands and thousands and 10,000 times 10,000. And that's what we're about to read. So after this, I saw thousands of thousands and 10,000 times 10,000. They were innumerable and incalculable, who were standing in the presence of the glory of the Lord of living ones. So this reminds us of the judgment scene in Daniel 7 and in Revelation 4. And so that's quite a similar image. Then it says, verse 2, so this is chapter 40, verse 2. I looked, and on the 4 sides of the Lord of spirits I saw 4 figures, different from those who sleep not, and I learned their names because the angel who went with me and showed me all the hidden things made their names known to me. Now, I won't read all of this because we have a lot to go through still, but basically it describes these 4 figures. One is named Michael, and then there's Raphael, Gabriel, and Phanuel. These are the 4 archangels, 4 figures who are right near the Lord of living ones, And each of them is described as having four, different tasks, or they're responsible for four different things. So the first one blesses the Lord of Spirits. The second one blesses the chosen one and the chosen ones who depend on the Lord of Spirits. The third one petitions for those who dwell on the earth. And then the fourth one drives away the Satans, plural. And I think recently someone mentioned Satans on the call. I mentioned how in the book of Enoch there are plural Satans or adversaries. And anyway, there's this fourth one, Phanuel, is described as being the one who drives away the adversaries and not letting them come before the Lord of Spirits to accuse those who dwell on earth. So this is some description, like what it's been describing here is this heavenly courtroom scene, which makes perfect sense once we get to this next part, going to chapter 41, verse 1. And after this, I saw all the secrets of heaven, how the kingdom is divided, and how human deeds are weighed in the balance. So here you have judgment according to our deeds. There I saw the dwelling places of the chosen and the dwelling places of the holy ones. And my eyes saw there all the sinners who deny the name of the Lord of Spirits being driven off from there, and they dragged them off, and they could not remain because of the scourge that went forth from the Lord of Spirits. So you have this driving away of sinners, and this is all seen in vision in the heavens. Now, Ellen White saw in vision Lucifer in the sanctuary, in the holy place of the heavenly sanctuary. And of course, it wasn't literal, and she described that quite clearly in early writings. This is a parable, and it's describing things which are being seen in the heavens as representing things to take place on the earth. What it's describing is the judgment for the living taking place in heaven and also on earth. So, of course, earlier in the first part of this first parable, it's quite clear that it was describing things taking place on heaven and the kings no longer possessing the land and the wicked being separated from the righteous on earth and so on and so forth. Now this is describing kind of the behind-the-scenes activity in the heavens, which is the judgment for the living taking place in the heavens, and how the human deeds are being weighed in the balance and so on and so forth. Now, right after this, it goes into what might be called these astronomical secrets, but it's a parable. And I won't read the whole thing, but what it describes, it says, and there my eyes saw the secrets of the lightnings and the thunder, and the secrets of the translation says winds, but really it's the same word as spirits or living ones. Saw the secrets of the clouds and the dew. Well, earlier, remember, he was caught up in a cloud and whirlwind. Earlier in chapter 39, verse 5, it talks about dew, and it says mercy like dew upon the earth. And, each element here is something that relates to something else. So you have heavenly things. You have the sun and the moon and the way that they travel, and all of it is a parable for living beings and how they interact with each other. And I'll read you something that shows quite clearly that that is the case. But I want to say before we get to that I do not understand all of what it actually is representing by this. And part of it is because there's clearly some sort of editorial something that's taken place here that confuses it. And so there's like kind of spliced in the middle of all this is this little section on wisdom and iniquity that has some relation to the context, but no clear continuity within the context. But in short, like the basic thing that it's trying to show is how there is this order, like the order of the heavenly bodies and the various things that take place in the heavens are representing these different beings, and some of the beings run according to the ordained paths, like each star and each bolt of lightning has its ordained path. And there are those that go according to their ordained paths, and then there are those that depart from their ordained paths. Those who go according to their ordained paths represent those who are ultimately the righteous. Those who depart from their ordained paths are those who are the wicked. They go into darkness. And so it has lightnings which are representing those who are the righteous. It has winds who are representing, quote unquote, the angels, certain heavenly beings. And actually later in the second or third parable, it specifically talks about that. It talks about how the wind of this is the angel of that. The wind of this is the angel of that. And so really clearly explains that symbolism later on. And then you have, clouds and dew, and I already mentioned about dew earlier and so forth. Each part represents something else. And then there's the sun and the moon. I'm not entirely clear what the sun and the moon represent in this instance. However, the sun seems to be connected either with the righteous one or the Lord of Spirits, based on what it said earlier in the parable of the faces of the righteous being lightened when the righteous one appears among them. So sun may be connected with that. And then the moon may be connected with wisdom. But like I said, this part about wisdom is really like out of place. It has a connection with the parables in general, but it's out of place. And so I can't say for sure, but when it talks about the moon, it talks about the moon emerging from its place and going and returning. When it talks about wisdom, it's in chapter 42, if you want to read the section on wisdom. It talks about how wisdom did not find a place where she might dwell. So her dwelling was in the heavens. Wisdom went forth to dwell among the children of men, but she did not find a dwelling. Wisdom returned to her place and sat down in the midst of the angels. So it's kind of this sad story of wisdom searching for a place to dwell among men, not finding it, and then returning to dwell among angels. But then in the context of the parables, that's not altogether a loss, because it said earlier that the dwelling of the righteous is among the angels, and that we are set in heavenly places with the chosen one. Very similar to what we read in Ephesians chapter 2, where those who are raised from death and trespasses and sins are set together in heavenly places with Christ. So here it's not necessarily disconnecting wisdom with the righteous, but it's saying she sought for a place to dwell and didn't find it among men, and so she took her seat among the angels. But the way that it describes her going forth and then returning, the words are very similar to the terms that are used for the sun and the moon going forth and returning. So there seems to be some sort of connection. But then it says, iniquity went forth from her chambers, iniquity's chambers. Those whom she did not seek, she found. And she dwelt among them like rain in a desert and dew in a thirsty land. So it's like wisdom went forth, trying to find people among whom to dwell, and couldn't find any, so she had to return to her place and dwell with angels. But iniquity went forth, not even seeking, and she found people to dwell with, and she dwelt among them as though they were thirsty land, soaking her up like dew. So it's like iniquity is having the day, as it were. So it seems odd, because generally speaking, within this parable, it's talking about the time of the judgment of the living, when positive things are happening, where the wicked are no longer having their way, and where the righteous are obtaining wisdom, and so on and so forth. So while this deals with similar themes, it's out of place in the context, and reading it, like if you just read as it occurs in the manuscripts from one verse, and then the verse that follows, and then the verse that follows, it makes no sense. Like, it's really out of the blue. And there are, throughout all of this one Enoch, there's a lot like that. Like, it's clearly undergone some crazy editing, and even the differences in the manuscripts show that the order of content is different in one manuscript to another. So, those are some of the complications to which I do not have the answers, and these are things that Enoch scholars don't really have the answers to either. They debate, but there is, I just found out about it today, another edition of First Enoch that is supposed to come out at the end of 2018 that takes into account many more manuscripts, something like 150 manuscripts or something like that. And so who knows, there may be more available information soon. Anyway, I'm sorry that that's the case and we can't just smoothly go through the subject. I really wish that was the case, but unfortunately that's not the state of the evidence that we have before us. So anyway, it goes on describing this whole thing with the sun and the moon, and gives this parable. And then in verse 8 of chapter 41, it says, "For the sun makes many revolutions for a blessing and a curse. And the course of the path of the moon is light to the righteous and darkness to the sinners." The moon, I have to point out, by the way, in this, it's not described as simply the sun having rulership over the day and the moon over the night. The moon has its path in the day and in the night, which is, of course, in harmony with material reality because, well, we just had a solar eclipse, which was the moon going between the earth and the sun. So there is a positive and a negative experience connected with the sun and with the moon, depending on who you are, whether righteous or wicked. So the course of the path of the moon is light to the righteous and darkness to the sinners, in the name of the Lord, who distinguished between light and darkness and divided the spirits of humanity. Boy, this sure sounds like 1QS at this point. And strengthened the spirits of the righteous in the name of his righteousness. And it goes on, the order here is confused. And then it says in chapter 43, verse 1, "And I saw other lightnings and stars of heaven, and I saw that he called them by their names, and they listened to him. And I saw a righteous balance, how they are weighed according to their light." So notice the balance, it was talking earlier about the judgment, right? How there's this judgment taking place in heaven, and how human deeds are weighed in the balance. That's chapter 41, verse 1. Now this says, "I saw a righteous balance, and how they," being the stars, "are weighed according to their light, according to the breadth of their spaces, and the day of their appearing. I saw how their revolution produces lightning, and their revolution is according to the number of the angels, and they keep their faith with one another. Okay, so you have the stars being judged, but the stars are judged according to their light. Light here, just as in Qumran sectarian literature, is a symbol of truth. So judged according to their light, according to their truth or their amount of truth, according to the breadth of their spaces. In other words, there's spaces between each star, and there's different, the space varies between one star and another, which ends up organizing the stars into constellations and shows how close the stars are to one another and whether they are in harmony relative to the other stars. So if you can tell that a star is out of place, it's out of harmony with them. And then the third thing is the day of their appearing. So there's three things according to which they are weighed: their light, the breadth of their spaces, and the day of their appearing. In verse 3 it says, "And I asked the angel who went with me and showed me what was hidden. What are these?" And he said to me, "The Lord of living ones has showed you a parable concerning them. These are the names of the holy ones who dwell on the earth and believe in the name of the Lord of living ones forever and ever." Okay, so there he's saying, he has shown all of these things about the stars and so on and so forth, and how they're weighed according to their light and their spaces and the day of their appearing. And he asks the angel who's showing him these things, "What are these?" And he says, "The Lord of living ones has showed you a parable concerning them. These are the names of the holy ones who dwell on the earth and believe on the name of the Lord of spirits forever and ever." Okay, so that's a very clear declaration that what he's seeing concerning the stars is a symbolic representation of the judgment of those who are on the earth. So these stars, and these are particularly those who are the holy ones and who believe in the name of the Lord of spirits, and they are represented by the stars, and they are judged and weighed according to their light, so according to the amount of truth they have, according to their spaces, the breadth of their spaces, which is their relation to each other, their unity or harmony, or the lack thereof. And they are judged according to the day of their appearing. So this is showing us that when people are judged, they're judged according to the amount of light they have. They are judged according to how they deal with each other and who they associate with. And they are judged according to the time in which they appear in the history of the cosmos. This is represented by the judging of the stars according to their brightness, the breadth of their spaces, and the day of their appearing. So it's basically a symbolic representation of how the judgment takes place. And there's this series of events in the heavens which parallels what takes place on earth. And then there's another brief statement which we'll have to skip for now before getting into the second parable. And I wish we could take the time to go through this in more detail, but we will not have the opportunity, seeing we've already been on for over 2 hours. But what I will do is read a couple brief sections and point out a couple things about this. And then I encourage you all to read this whole section in 1 Enoch. But this second parable really gets into basically the Son of Man and the Ancient of Days. Just like in Daniel 7, But the Ancient of Days here, in some manuscripts, he's called the Ancient of Days, but in most manuscripts, and what most scholars consider the more reliable manuscripts, to be called the Head of Days. So the second parable starts in chapter 45, verse 1. This is the second parable concerning those who deny the name of the dwelling of the holy ones and of the Lord of living ones. To heaven they will not ascend, and on earth they will not come. Thus will be the lot of the sinners who have denied the name of the Lord of living ones, who will be kept thus for the day of affliction and tribulation. And then from verses 3 to 6 of chapter 45, there's an out-of-place bit of text which all of a sudden is speaking in first-person God language, like God is speaking, I this, and so on, and it actually refers to the transformation of the heaven and the transformation of the earth, basically the new heavens and the new earth, wherein no unrighteousness will dwell. So we're going to have to skip ahead to chapter 46. So this is talking about seeing things in the heavens, and says, There I saw one who had a head of days, and his head was like white wool. And with him was another whose face was like the appearance of a man, and his face was full of graciousness, like one of the holy angels. And I asked the angel of peace who went with me and showed me all the hidden things about the Son of Man, who he was, and whence he was, and why he went with the head of days. Then he answered me and said, This is the Son of Man who has righteousness, and righteousness dwells with him, and all the treasuries of what is hidden he will reveal. For the Lord of living ones has chosen him, and his lot has prevailed through truth, in the presence of the Lord of living ones forever. Okay, so this one who is this Son of Man is the Son of Man who has righteousness. Remember, the chosen one of righteousness and truth was what was referred to earlier in chapter 39. The chosen one also, it said that truth did not fail before him. Well, here it says his lot has prevailed through truth. It even says that the Lord of Spirits has chosen him, and he is in the presence of the Lord of Spirits forever, the Lord of living ones. So the description of this person is the same as the description of the chosen one. So the chosen one and the Son of Man are the same. But this is revealing more about him. Before, he was just a chosen one. He's just someone who is chosen. But here, he is further identified as being human, Son of Man. And he's with the Ancient of Days, but he is all about righteousness. He is the one who has righteousness. Righteousness dwells with him. All the treasuries of what is hidden, he will reveal. So whoever this Son of Man is very, very significant. Verse 4, And this Son of Man whom you have seen, he will raise the kings and the mighty from their couches, and the strong from their thrones. He will loosen the reins of the strong. He will crush the teeth of the sinners. He will overturn the kings from their thrones and their kingdoms, etc., etc., etc. It says all these things that he does, where he's basically overthrowing the kingdoms of those who persecute the righteous. And in fact, I'll go forward, verse 7. These are they, these kings, who cast down the stars of heaven and tread upon those who dwell upon the earth. Okay, so obviously the stars of heaven are being trodden down by these kings. The stars of heaven are the righteous. Just like in Daniel 8, verse 10, it talks about people trampling down the hosts of heaven who are the righteous. So this is just another instance of a verse which clearly shows that the stars of heaven in these parables are representatives of the righteous upon earth. And the kings of the earth are trampling down these people. All their deeds manifest unrighteousness, and their power rests upon their wealth. Their faith is in the gods they have made with their hands, and they deny the name of the Lord of living ones. And they persecute the house of his congregation, and the faithful who depend on the name of the Lord of living ones. In those days there had arisen the prayer of the righteous, and the blood of the righteous one from the earth into the presence of the Lord of living ones. Now it goes on talking about an intercession that is done, and considering the cry of the blood of the righteous one. Now it's really interesting how you have the righteous one who is equated with the chosen one, who is equated with the Son of Man, and here you have the blood of the righteous one. So really seems to be that this righteous one, whoever it is, this Son of Man, has shed blood. The other way to translate it, though, is not to translate the righteous one, even though most translations do say the righteous one, and that seems to be a title for this figure. If one wanted to say, oh, this isn't talking about that figure, the Son of Man, and he has shed blood, it's talking about just the righteous in general, because you could translate it either as the righteous, even though it's singular, it could be referring to the collective group of the righteous, or it could be the righteous one. Seems like Jesus sure understood this as referring to the righteous one, the actual title of the person who is the Son of Man, though, because Jesus referred to how the Son of Man must suffer many things at the hands of sinners, according to the Scriptures. While the only place in the Hebrew Bible, in the Protestant canon, where we have the Son of Man is, well, you have the Son of Man in Daniel, and that's really the only place where it's like, that's the title for this figure. And then you have Ezekiel, who's called, O Son of Man, just because he's a child of humanity. So lots of times people think, oh, well, Jesus is basing his discussion of the Son of Man off of Daniel, but there's nothing in Daniel that would say that the Son of Man suffers. Even in Ezekiel, there's nothing that would say that the Son of Man suffers. But if the Son of Man here, the righteous one, if it is to be translated the righteous one, rather than simply the righteous as in the righteous people, then it's clearly describing how he must have undergone some sort of suffering, because it's, the blood of the righteous one is being presented in heaven. And again, the righteous one is definitely used as a title for the Son of Man here. So it seems like a very consistent translation. It seems like the only reason why you would say, oh no, it's not the righteous one, it's just the righteous, is in order to say that this can't be referring to the Son of Man as having suffered. But here's the thing. When it talks about him, the language that it uses for the Son of Man is parallel to language from Isaiah, including Isaiah 53, which clearly has a suffering servant. So anyway, this may very well be providing a lot of basis for Jesus' whole mission, because Jesus clearly, his primary title for understanding himself is the Son of Man, and his primary, or one of the primary things that he understood himself to do is to reveal the truth, which is what the Son of Man is supposed to do. It says that all the treasuries of what is hidden he will reveal in chapter 46, verse 3, and then talks about the shed blood of the righteous one. So you can see where Jesus, if he's reading this book or acquainted with these ideas, could clearly get this understanding. So anyway, going to verse 3 of chapter 47. In those days I saw the head of days as he took his seat on the throne of his glory, and the books of the living were opened in his presence, and all his hosts, which was in the heights of heaven, and his court were standing in his presence. Okay, I've never read an ancient text with a more clear description of the opening of the judgment of the living in heaven than that. The books of the living were opened in his presence, the presence of the head of days, and all his hosts, which was in the heights of heaven, and his court were standing in his presence. So this is clearly the heavenly court. The hosts of heaven gathered, standing in his presence in the heights of heaven, and it refers to it as his court. This is very clearly the judgment scene, and it's the books of the living that are open. And of course, in the context of the parables, this is all about the investigative judgment for the living and the judicial judgment for the living, judicial phase, I should say, of the judgment for the living, and the execution of the judgment for the living. This is all about the judgment for the living. But it talks about the one who's doing this judgment for the living is the Son of Man. And so far, what have we learned about the Son of Man? Well, he is the chosen one who dwells in the presence of the Lord of Spirits, also called the Head of Days. He is called the Righteous One. Righteousness is a characteristic element of what he is all about. He is the one to reveal the treasuries of what has been hidden. He is the one who overturns the power of the rulers of the earth who oppress his people. And he is the one whose blood is presented before the presence of the Lord of living ones. So now we have the books of the living open. So we have this heavenly court scene. The Son of Man is there. His blood is presented. And the books of the living are opened. And now what happens? Going on to the next verse. So that was verse 3. And the books of the living were opened in his presence, and all his host, which was in the heights of heaven, and his court were standing in his presence. And the hearts of the holy ones were filled with joy, for the number of the righteous was at hand. So, at hand being like, it's right there, about to happen. And the prayer of the righteous had been heard, and a reckoning of the blood of the righteous one had been required in the presence of the Lord of living ones. In that place I saw the spring of righteousness, and it was inexhaustible, and many springs of wisdom surrounded it, and all the thirsty drank from them and were filled with wisdom, and their dwelling places were with the righteous and holy and the chosen. So, judgment of the living opens, springs of wisdom and righteousness issuing forth, and the thirsty drink from the springs and are filled with wisdom. By the way, I have to share this one parallel because, the Odes of Solomon we've seen to be so very important. Oh, and I actually don't have it with me, but one second. I can pull it up quickly on my computer. The Odes of Solomon are so very important, and we've seen that they have such a connection with Jesus. And, okay, there we are. Okay, look at this parallel, just so you can see, there's clearly some sort of influence here. 1 Enoch 48, verse 1. And all the thirsty... Okay, actually, I'll read a little bit before this. In that place I saw the spring of righteousness, and it was inexhaustible. And many springs of wisdom surrounded it. And all the thirsty drank from them and were filled with wisdom. Okay, so in the Ode of Solomon, Ode 6, verse 11, it's talking about springs of water issuing forth, and it talks about how it spread over the whole earth. And then in verse 11 it says, Then all the thirsty upon the earth drank, and thirst was relieved and quenched. For from the Most High the drink was given. Blessed, therefore, are the ministers of that drink who have been entrusted with his water. So, I mean, that's just one, really oh, wow. The odes really share this language, and there are other instances of that as well, which I probably won't mention when we get to it. But here you have the judgment for the living open in heaven, a spring of righteousness and many springs of wisdom surrounding it, and all the thirsty drink and are filled with wisdom. And then it says, and in that hour, an hour is the smallest unit of time in the ancient world. So at that moment, or in that hour, in that hour, that Son of Man was named in the presence of the Lord of living ones.
Mm-hmm.
Now that's very interesting, and all branches should find that very interesting because...
Repeat it for them.
Sure. So I'll repeat this again, and you guys think of, why might this be interesting for us? So the judgment for the living is opened, springs of righteousness and wisdom issue forth, and then the Son of Man is named in the presence of the Lord of spirits, or the Lord of living ones. So, of course, the branch teaching, and even prior to branch teaching specifically, Victor Hoddeth, he talked about how the judgment of the living would begin at the end of the 430 years. And then he also said that at the end of the 430 years, the new name would be given. Well, here, this is the only text which I know of from the ancient world which spells out that when the judgment for the living opens, the Son of Man would be given a name.
Cool.
Yeah, super cool. Super cool. So, yeah, that's okay, definitely...
noteworthy.
Yes, definitely noteworthy. That should definitely draw our attention. But it's interesting because then it says something else, which I also find very interesting in light of the new name of Jesus being branch. So it says, in that hour the Son of Man was named in the presence of the Lord of living ones, and his name before the head of days. Even before the sun and the constellations were created, before the stars of heaven were made, his name was named before the Lord of living ones. The first time I read this, before I understood that this isn't actually a book of Enoch, and it's not like this is one book and all of that, I was so confused by this. But I had read this before, and I notice that it has the naming of the Son of Man when the judgment for living opens. And clearly when the judgment for the living opens, it's describing the judgment for the living in terms of the judgment of the stars. So the stars are already in existence, the stars and all of that, and it's talking about the righteous and the wicked. But then it says, even before the sun and the constellations were made, before the stars of heaven were made, his name was named before the Lord of living ones. Now, what that is saying is that even though he was named like the name was given to him, he was named when the judgment for the living opens, that his name was appointed before any of this was made. It's not saying that the event of the judgment opening is before any of this stuff, because that would contradict every bit of the description of the judgment for the living, where you have all the stars being judged and all of that. And so it's what it's doing. It's like a parenthetical note saying that he's given this name at this appointed time, but this name was appointed before any of this was. Now, I said I wasn't going to mention the other thing from the Ode of Solomon, but I think I'm going to mention this other thing from the Ode of Solomon, even though it doesn't go into it like so specifically, but it's just so interesting because it talks about the Son of Man being named. And this is what it says. This is Ode 36, verse 3. And this is Christ speaking. And of course, this is a composition written after Jesus' ministry, so it's actually supposed to be Christ. The Spirit brought me forth before the Lord's face, so in the presence of the Lord. And because I was the Son of Man, I was named the light, the Son of God. So this is really interesting. He's named the light, the Son of God. Now there's clearly a parallel, the Son of Man being named before the Lord. Here it says before the Lord's face. In the parables, it says, in the presence of the Lord of living ones. In the parables, it says he was named, but it doesn't say anything about the name other than that it was appointed before the stars of heaven were made, before the sun, before the constellations, before the stars of heaven were named. His name was named, but the name wasn't given to him until the judgment for the living. Here in the Odes, it says that it's him speaking. I was the Son of Man. I was named the light, the Son of God. Now, what's so interesting about that is that, of course, the judgment for the living did not actually commence until 1955, and we know that the name that he was named was Branch, but the meaning of the name Branch is son. He's the son of God. He's a branch of God. He's the child in the family tree. That's like, the branch in regard to being descendants of man in Isaiah 11. The branch of David is the son of David. The branch of God is the son of God. Now, of course, it doesn't say I was named Branch, which I wouldn't expect it to say prior to the judgment for the living, because that's when the name is actually given to him and actually revealed. But the name evidently has been in existence from the beginning, according to this writing embedded in 1 Enoch. And here in the Odes of Solomon, even though it doesn't give his name as Branch, it has a connection with this place in the Parables of Enoch, which is in harmony with the understanding of the branch, both in terms of the understanding of the branch message and in the understanding of Branch being Jesus' new name. The other thing that I'll say is that Branch being Jesus' new name, obviously we're speaking in English. In Hebrew, it's a different thing. In other languages, it's different. And in Hebrew and in the scriptures generally, it doesn't seem to be so fussy about the actual word that's used for the name. A name of someone has much more to do with the meaning than it has to do with the word that you use. which is why in some places when it's talking about Jesus as the branch, it's the word tzemach in Hebrew, and in other places it's netzer. There's actually two Hebrew words that mean basically the same thing, and both of them are called his name. So even though I can understand from our perspective, because we like things to be so neat in our post-enlightenment way of thinking, we want it to be like, no, his name either has to be tzemach or netzer. Or when it says that, where he says, I'm the Son of Man and I was named the light, the Son of God, we want to be like, no, I want it to just say branch, or I want it to just say Son of God, or just say light, or just say something else. And it's like, no, it's actually more fluid than that. The ancient way of viewing it was more fluid. And let's face it, netzer and tzemach are Hebrew, and Hebrew has not been around forever. There was a time prior to the existence of what we call Hebrew. At one point, Hebrew and Aramaic were indistinguishable from each other. They gradually diverged to become separate languages. Hebrew and Canaanite at one point were the same and gradually diverged to become different languages. Just like, how Spanish and French all come from Latin, and they gradually diverged. That's just how it happens. And so, given that tzemach and netzer are Hebrew, and Hebrew has not always existed, here you have this name that was named before the constellations. Well, you know what? Whatever the name was, like, let's just say that this is like all totally legit and real, and that this Son of Man was actually given this name, and it was in whatever language, that the Lord of Living Ones knew this name prior to this earth and all of that. It wouldn't have been in English, it wouldn't have been in Hebrew, it would have been in whatever language. And whatever that name was, it could have very well encompassed the meaning of the word branch, the word Son of God, or the phrase Son of God. Because, as I said, the meaning of branch being a child in a family tree structure and son are basically the same thing. So let's not be too fussy over precisely what word we use for the name. The meaning is what is so much more important in these ancient scriptures. So anyway, his name is named. I'm going to read a little bit more here. So we are in chapter 48, verse 4. He will be a staff for the righteous. Actually, one other thing that I have to say. This is one place, and there are many other places, where the Son of Man is viewed as being pre-existent throughout these parables. So we have a pre-existent Son of Man who is also the chosen one, who is also the righteous one, who stands before the head of days, and so on and so forth. This is incredible that this is a writing from before the time of Jesus. Honestly, it's really, really, wow. You read then the Gospels, and it just makes so much more sense. And as much as I don't want to be anachronistic and say that this author had Jesus in mind, because clearly the author didn't, this visionary experience of the Son of Man, and especially understanding that the Son of Man and the righteous one are the same, and that the passages which describe the blood of the righteous one, if the phrase righteous one is to be translated righteous one there, I mean, man, who could say that this is not fulfilled with Jesus? So anyway, I want to continue on a bit because there are some really beautiful things that I have to say here. He will be a staff for the righteous. that they may lean on him and not fall. He will be the light to the nations. That's like what it says in Isaiah 49, verse 6, Luke 2:32. And he will be a hope for those who grieve in their hearts. All who dwell on the earth will fall down and worship before him, and they will glorify and bless and sing hymns to the name of the Lord of living ones. For this reason he was chosen and hidden in his presence before the world was made and forever. So clearly he's pre-existent and yet a Son of Man. This is where you have hints at something like an incarnation even prior to Jesus. And the wisdom of the Lord of living ones has revealed him to the holy and the righteous, for he has preserved the lot of the righteous. For they have hated and despised this age of unrighteousness. Indeed, all its deeds and its ways they have hated in the name of the Lord of living ones. For in his name they are saved, and he is the vindicator of their lives. In those days, downcast will be the faces of the kings of the earth, and the strong who possess the land, because the deeds of their hands. For on the day of their tribulation and distress they will not save themselves, and into the hand of my chosen ones I shall throw them, as straw in the fire and as lead in the water. Thus they will burn before the face of the holy, and they will sink before the face of the righteous, and no trace of them will be found. And on the day of their distress there will be rest on the earth, and before them they will fall and not rise, and there will be no one to take them with his hand and raise them, for they have denied the Lord of living ones and his anointed one. Blessed be the name of the Lord of spirits. For wisdom has been poured out like water, and glory will not fail in his presence forever and ever. For he is mighty in all the secrets of righteousness, and unrighteousness will vanish like a shadow, and will have no place to stand. For the chosen one has taken his stand in the presence of the Lord of living ones, and his glory is forever and ever, and his might to all generations. And in him dwell the spirit of wisdom, and the spirit of insight, and the spirit of instruction, and the spirit of might. This is sounding like Isaiah 11, right? That's a prophecy of the branch. Well, if this was written when scholars think it was written, this author is specifically invoking Isaiah's prophecy of the branch. So he's identifying this Son of Man who is named the Anointed One, the Chosen One, the Righteous One, as being the branch, which is quite interesting. And the spirit of those who have fallen asleep in righteousness, and he will judge the things that are secret, and a lying word none will be able to speak in his presence, for he is the chosen one in the presence of the Lord of living ones, according to his good pleasure. In those days a change will occur for the holy and chosen, and the light of many days will dwell upon them. And glory and honor will return to the holy. On the day of distress, evil will be stored up against the sinners, and the righteous will conquer in the name of the Lord of living ones. And he will show this to the others, so that they repent and abandon the works of their hands, and they will have honor in the presence of the Lord of living ones, and in his name they will be saved. And the Lord of living ones will have mercy on them, for great is his mercy. There's more that could be read here. It goes on, it talks about the righteous, it talks about the judgment, and it talks about the glory of that day, of the judgment of the living. And then there's this whole vision of 6 mountains, and then there's a whole third parable beyond that. Like I said, it's impossible that we'll be able to cover this. But we actually did get through what I wanted to get through, which is awesome. Pretty much, I had to skip some sections, but one of the things I should say, or some of the things which we should gather from this, is that there is a text which claims to be a product of inspiration, which claims to be written by an individual who doesn't claim to be Enoch, even though this is embedded within First Enoch. And this individual had a message which he believed to be very, very important. And it had to do with the judgment of the living. The judgment of the living is pictured as taking place both in heaven and on earth. The judgment scene in heaven includes a Son of Man who shed blood, who has as his mission to teach truth and righteousness, the hidden things of the Lord of living ones. That when the judgment for the living opens, that Son of Man will be named. The Son of Man is pre-existent, existed before the stars and all of that, before the creation of the world, and yet is indeed a man, Son of Man. The Son of Man is the chosen one, the righteous one, the anointed one. Anointed one is Mashiach, the Messiah. And the picture given concerning the judgment for the living is that when the judgment for the living opens, there will be fountains of righteousness and wisdom that will be opened, that all who are thirsty may drink, and that in the judgment for the living, a congregation of righteous will be manifested, and that the wicked will be separated from the righteous. That congregation of righteous will be characterized by wisdom, by truth, by righteousness. They will be instrumental in this final day of cleansing from sin. And that this cleansing will result in a social overthrow where those who are currently ruling the earth will no longer rule the earth. And that the light of truth will be shining from this group of righteous so much that the kings of the earth will lose their dominion and will no longer rule the land, and that God's kingdom will be established. So that's the message that this has to put forward. It is very, very clear that this had a strong influence on Jesus. I mean, now we can understand, reading this, how he could develop the understanding of himself as being the Son of Man. And of course, there's, we don't know all of exactly what his understanding was. There's still more to study in relation to that. But it's absolutely incredible that we have this writing from before the time of Jesus, and then we have the mission of Jesus, and then we lost this writing for a long time. We didn't know anything about it. And then the branch message arose, and it says things about Jesus concerning the judgment for the living that are the same thing that this book says. Mm-hmm. Most Bible believers, whether Jews or Christians, and most Adventists even, do not have an understanding of the judgment for the living. They don't have an understanding that it's a series of events which takes place both in heaven and on earth. That's something that Victor Hoddeth emphasized. And the branch emphasized that as well. And the branch talked about the Son of Man being given a new name and presenting his blood in the courts of heaven, and the judgment for the living opening, and of course we have wisdom being a feminine entity described in the branch message and so on. And all of those elements, which I just mentioned, are here in this book that we didn't know anything about for a very long time until, well, just now is the first time that we're really studying it together. However, it has been available to the Western world for longer, but we haven't known about it, even though it has been available and some scholars have been studying it. But it's really incredible that we have such a writing as this. And I really do believe that it is another among many confirmations of the truth of this message.
Amen.
Because you have to, really just consider how over and over again it's like, okay, well, we're teaching these things. And at first, in this message, what the teaching was based on the Psalms, primarily. That was one of the first things that we had. It was really focusing on the Psalms and the message of justification by faith. That's the early stuff. And the things that we were teaching were really clear, okay, this is from the Psalms and this is what justification is. And, of course, looking at Paul's writings and all of that. And, of course, anything I say right now is going to leave out a lot. But that was the focus at the beginning. And then it's wow, we learn about the canon, we learn about materialism, we learn about all these other things. And then we go back and in learning about the canon, when learning about all these other texts, because now we know we need to study them, the Thanksgiving hymns were wow, look at this. This is teaching the same thing that we are teaching. And Barki Nafshi, the various writings of the teacher of righteousness are teaching the same understanding of how truth brings about the salvation of repentant sinners and how that brings about the establishment of the kingdom, and even the very prophecies in the Psalms, in Isaiah, in Zechariah, that we brought together in the very early phases of our message, or that our Heavenly Family brought together and gave me an understanding of to present in the very early phases of this message. Those very combinations of texts are brought together in the Thanksgiving hymns, and in Barki Nafshi, the teacher of righteousness had the mission and identity of this message and messenger. And it's wow, it's shocking that you have something that's lost in caves for 2,000 years, and then the message that we have is the same as that. It's absolutely stunning. That happened for the Thanksgiving hymns. It happened again for Barki Nafshi, although Barki Nafshi isn't so shocking after the Thanksgiving hymns because it's from the same source. But then here, there's all these additional things about the Son of Man and about the naming of the Son of Man and the judgment for the living being earthly and heavenly, which, it ties together some of the things from the Teacher of Righteousness material, but it has all these additional things that are part of the branch message that we didn't know about, and here it is in this other writing that, again, was lost for so long. And all of this really helps us to understand the mission of Jesus more, and it helps us to understand our own mission, our own message. How many times does this have to happen for us to be wow, there is divine providence involved here?
I'm convinced.
Oh, yeah. We could find these ancient texts and they could say anything. And there are ancient texts out there who say a whole bunch of stuff, that really don't agree with this message. But these teachings are not common things that you would just expect to find. Oh yeah, a combination of teachings which has the Holy Spirit feminine, justification by faith, the true understanding of the nature of truth, the nature of morality, the naming of the Son of Man. Like, we could go down the list of, like, all these specific teachings that are not popular in the ancient world or in the modern world. And yet, that's the message our Heavenly Family has given to us. And then we get to go and read these ancient texts and find the same message there, which even have true prophecies that were fulfilled in Christ. It's absolutely stunning.
I love how they continue to give us more and more confirmation as they continue to strip away our false understanding, because they know that as we come to unlearn things and we realize we've thought things to be a certain way and we're learning that they're not a certain way, that the devil's going to use that to try to convince us that it's all just a big fabrication. But you have to ignore an awful lot to believe that lie, that it's all a fabrication.
No kidding.
And so they just continue to give us more confirmation.
Hey, I know someone's going to comment, but please wait for a second because our phone's about to cut out. We'll call right back. Thank you. Okay, we are back. Thank you guys for your patience. So who was that was saying something?
I just said amen to Teresa's comments.
Okay, awesome. Amen.
I second them.
Amen.
And all of it. It's really something. Go ahead.
I just want to say briefly on Teresa's comment, how, there's this struggle of like, having all of these falsehoods stripped away from us, and we can be tempted to throw out the baby with the bathwater. But let's think of how unreasonable that would be, right? I mean, just because we thought something was wrong on one particular issue, there's nothing about being wrong on one particular issue, which necessarily means that we were wrong on another particular issue. And so it's just the feeling that the enemy wants us to get when we have to unlearn something, where we get this feeling like, oh no, what I believed is wrong, and then we want to carry that over to all these other things. And that just doesn't even make any sense. Like, there's actually no reason to that at all. So, it's just, one way to think about this too is if history had so happened to take place in a way where the writings that were canonized were only those which claimed inspiration and which really were a product of inspiration, and that, the Pentateuch wasn't combined how it ended up being, and the Book of Enoch wasn't combined as it ended up being, and all these other textual things and whatever. If none of that happened, and we just had writings in a canon that, and still I don't think that the idea of canon is valid to begin with, but let's just say that history developed where there still was a canon, but it was only writings that claimed inspiration and actually were a product of inspiration. And if a lot of the truths and, weren't lost, and that there wasn't this huge misinterpretation of things, well, then there wouldn't be a problem. Like, we wouldn't have this whole thing of like, oh no, I was wrong on something, therefore I'm wrong on all this other stuff.
We'd already believe very differently.
Exactly.
Than we do now.
We would already definitely believe very differently than we do now.
On some points. But I love how our Heavenly Family is confirming the important parts. The pre-incarnation of Jesus, the teaching of righteousness and truth, materialism, some of those core foundations they keep emphasizing over and over and over, and pointing us to the message of the branch and, the truth of our Heavenly Family, Hey, what else really matters besides that, that they exist, who they are, what they're about, what they're trying to do for humanity? These other little details that we've been wrong on don't change any of that.
And in fact, think about it in this way. if you look at all of the things that we've been wrong on, all of the misconceptions that we've had to give up, none of them are the unique teachings of anyone who we consider to be an inspired messenger.
Right.
None of them are. So, like, if you were to take all the writings and everything that we know, and you were to just look at what are the writings that claim inspiration, and what are the ones that we know for sure are, like, what messengers do we know are inspired messengers, and what do they teach? And if you were to look at all of that, and even if it's stuff that we have already believed prior to this phase of the message, we still say that all of the unique teachings of all the messengers which we've considered to actually be true messengers, even before this message, we still actually agree with every unique teaching which they brought forward. Every single one of them. And if you look at all the other things that we've thought, none of them belong to the category of unique teachings of people who we believe to be inspired messengers. So there's something that we've been doing in this message a lot, and I've thought about it in this way before, but Teresa, the other day we were talking about this, and she phrased things in a way that was just very concise and very crystal clear. And she said something like, if we were to look at only the writings which we know to be a product of inspiration, and look at only the unique claims brought forward by those inspired messages.
Starting with a clean slate. We didn't know anything before that.
Exactly. And only claim that. Only believe that. And forget everything else. Like, everything else is up in the air. Not saying that it's all false, but forget all that. What would we actually believe? And what would we not believe? And that's something that's basically what we've been doing in this message, to try and say, hey, and, you know, to some degree, I will say, I'll throw a qualifier on that. It's not that we only want to believe just what the messages of inspiration teach us. We also want to believe whatever is true, even if it's not a particular focus of a message of inspiration.
Right.
So I want to believe the truth concerning what is healthful to eat, and so on and so forth.
When gravity exists.
Yeah, and the truth of gravity, whatever that is, even though that is actually something that's quite complicated. But, you know, I want to believe the truth about everything. But our Heavenly Family doesn't give inspired messages and appoint prophets to give truth about every topic. So, but, you know, in terms of these inspired, you know, the messages of the prophets, basically, what we ought to do is find out who really were the true messengers, who really did bear messages of inspiration. Find out what the unique teachings were, and promote that and only that as the message. Any writing that we find, whether it's in the Bible or whether it's in the Apocrypha or in, quote-unquote, the pseudepigrapha, if it doesn't claim inspiration, we shouldn't include it as being part of the message. If it says truth about something else, whether it's history, whether it's, you know, whatever it may be, biology, chemistry, it doesn't matter. Yeah, sure, acknowledge whatever truth anything has, but the message is just what is given to us through the messengers who are sent by our Heavenly Family. And even the things that they said that wasn't unique to them, it's not like we're required to, you know, agree with David and Solomon and all these other ancient people that the sky is a solid dome, just because that was the common conception of their day. No, we need to look at the unique messages, and that is what defines the message. Our Heavenly Family does actually inspire people on other topics too, not in the same way. They don't appoint messengers to be their spokespeople to bear a divine message about other topics, but they do. Inspiration is broader than just the messages our Heavenly Family sends. Victor Otto pointed out that our Heavenly Family, well, he said God has inspired the advancement of modern technology for the sake of forwarding the gospel. And we talked about this a little bit at the LBC the other day, about how there are actually lots of scientific discoveries that were made through dreams.
Well, they were prompted at least, right? So they had the dream, and then it was verified.
Well, it depends. Some of them were made through the dream. Some of them they related to dreams in different ways, depending on which one it was. But one of them, the guy, Bruno, whatever his first name was, how he had this revelation through a dream that the universe was a huge place. You know, everyone before that thought the sky was a solid dome and it was a small universe and all the stars and everything were close. But this guy, he had a dream that it was this huge place and the sun was the center of our local system and the earth went around the sun, not vice versa, and that there were other suns out there, like basically the sun is just a star among many stars, and other stars had planets going around them, and you know, he had all this stuff that now is verified to be true, but he only knew it through a dream, and he was persecuted through the Inquisition for saying all that, was actually burned at the stake for it 10 years before Galileo looked through a telescope. Well, I mean, we definitely know that it was the enemy working through the Inquisition and burning people at the stake and all of that. So would it make sense to say that the enemy gave him that dream? No, I think our Heavenly Family gave him that dream. That was actually a revelation of a scientific truth, which was then later confirmed. And there's other instances of that. So our Heavenly Family does work to bring about the betterment of mankind through revelation of other things other than what they appoint messengers to share as a message. And the reason why I mentioned that specific one is because understanding, you know, the truth about our solar system and about the, you know, extent of the universe and all of that is a necessary part of what it took to put satellites in space and to develop communication technology like we have today, which is precisely what Victor Otto was talking about when he said that God inspired the advancement of modern technology in order to forward the spreading of the gospel. You know, that's communication technology. So, anyway, all of this is to say that our Heavenly Family is awesome. The message that they give is awesome. This writing that we've been going through today is awesome. Again, I'm not trying to advocate the entirety of First Enoch as being like a true book or a product of inspiration. The book of Enoch, as we have it, First Enoch, is composed of several originally independent texts, and even those originally independent texts are a product of editing. They have undergone editing and all of that, but this does have a chord that is discernible within it, where there's a message of a particular messenger, very likely coming from between the time of the teacher of righteousness and the time of Jesus, who bore a message that definitely had a huge influence on Jesus' teaching and is a confirmation of the present message. So that's it, guys. That's the end of today's study.
Awesome study.
You know, Trent, what you said earlier, that it was just stunning. It really is. It's stunning what we learned today. And the affirmation and confirmation, as Teresa brought out, and it's very humbling to hear all this. Very thankful for it.
Amen. All right. Well, since we've been on for over 3 hours, I think we'll thank our Heavenly Family, and then we'll end the meeting. Eloheinu, our mighty ones, thank you so very, very much for this wonderful day. Thank you for the fact that we have all these writings at our disposal to look at, and it is absolutely shocking and stunning and awesome to be able to go back and read these texts and find in them the message of Jesus before Jesus, and the message of the branch before the branch. And yeah, Heavenly Family, thank you so much for confirming to us all these various elements of the message, and through this confirmation, giving us a further understanding of them. And I know that we have much yet to learn and much to unlearn, and I ask that you please help all of the branch candidates to be able to survive the shaking.
Amen.
Help us to be able to make it and to remember that we are in the judgment for the living, and that as much as there are tests and trials, there's fountains of righteousness and wisdom from which we can drink and be refreshed and to be livened. So please help us, Heavenly Family. Guide us to be that congregation of righteousness who will make a difference in the world and who will share your truth and your love so that others may repent. Help us to be the ministers of the drink.
Mm-hmm.
Todah, thank you. All of this we ask and think in the name of branch, Netzer, Tzemach, etc. Todah. Amen.
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 All right, love you all. Shalom.
Happy new moon.